When I was 13, I fell in love with a guy who said that he was 17. His family was from Haiti. I was a tomboy back then, so I was just excited to have somebody, anybody, like me. We started a romance. I was with him until about 16. He always snuck me around, and I obviously hid him as well. My mom would kill me if she knew that I had a boyfriend at that age. I would cut school and sneak into his house to, well, you know. His grandma, who he lived with, always creeped me out. She was indigenous and wore long, African-looking dresses and hated me. She saw me a few times and would outwardly show, disgust. I never understood why. Fast forward. I was 16. My boyfriend was acting weird. I got suspicious when I received some prank phone calls. I asked to see his phone logs. Long story short, I called some weird numbers and found out that he was having relations with 12 to 13-year-olds. Still, even though he was with me. I was so angry at this point. He was 20-ish. So I went to the police. I don't know why. I just did. They looked him up and down and told me that he wasn't 20. He was actually 27 and had had former charges for statutory rape. They asked me to tell them where he worked. Turns out, he was a pedophile the entire time. No wonder his grandma was disgusted at me. I looked like a child, and she knew his age. He was arrested, and I was asked to testify. This is where the scary stuff happens, by the way, if you've made it this far. 1 week before testifying, I was sleeping in my bed. I had a full-sized bed against the wall. This is important because on the other side of that wall was my mom's room. As a child, I would knock on the wall when I got scared, and she would come and rescue me. That night, I was on my back when I woke up with sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I knew because I frantically tried to reach for the wall and couldn't. My limbs felt abnormally heavy and wouldn't budge. I felt serious pressure on my chest, although there was nothing on it. And then I saw it. On my left, standing or kneeling next to me, was what I would call or only describe as a demon. He didn't give me a violent vibe. What was terrifying is it was ominous. Smug even. He looked male, dark skin, almost like a seaweed green. Texture was bumpy, rigid. I just remember extremely sharp features. Pointy nose, pointy head, pointy chin. Very triangular looking. One thing I absolutely cannot forget is the smile. He has an ear-to-ear grin, a confident and perverted smile. I was terrified, unable to scream. And then I felt it. He shoved his disgusting fingers down my throat. This is where it gets almost perverted. It was a vigorous motion. He enjoyed it. It hurt. I closed my eyes and didn't know what else to do but pray. I'm not even religious, and I just prayed and begged for help. I felt the pressure lift off of my body, and my mouth was suddenly clear. I was too scared to move or open my eyes, so I pretended to continue to sleep and ignored the taste of iron in my mouth. I woke up the next morning absolutely mortified. I couldn't speak. My throat felt as if I had swallowed glass. There was blood on my pillow and in my mouth. I ran to my mom. I tried to voice what had happened. She was scared for me, but told me that it was all a dream. I didn't testify. I was scared to speak, and my throat hurt. I was just so stressed with everything, I wanted nothing to do with anybody. He went to jail anyways because at that point, it was the state against him, not me. Time passed. I grew terrified to sleep alone. I always felt like the demon was in my room. I never saw him again, but I felt his presence everywhere I went. I would sleep facing the door and pray before bed, always. I would hear it in my dreams, sometimes telling me, "I'm still here," mocking me as I would run down the stairs in my dream and my legs would grow heavy. I would try to get out of my house, and I had to fight my body to move in my dream. There was even a time when I was at an ex-boyfriend's house years later, and I was brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden out of nowhere felt the hairs on my body rise, and I had this insane panic knowing that the demon was there. He was literally hovering on me. I couldn't see him or smell him or anything, but I felt his presence. I ran to my ex's bed and asked him to sleep on top of me the entire night to protect me. I had never in my life broken down like that. I can't explain it. I just knew that the demon was there trying to break in again. So I was about 22 when I got a phone call from the pedophile ex. He found me and called to check on me. Despite him being sick, he did love me in his own way, I think. I don't know. I don't feel like digging into it. Point is, he found me and called. He thanked me for not testifying. He said it saved him more time in jail. I had to ask. I asked him if he knew anything about demons. I then told him what had happened and asked if he could do anything with it because I remember him telling me things about his grandma doing hoodoo. He was silent. Then he finally told me without many details that he didn't exactly know what his grandmother had done, but all he knew was that a few weeks before the trial, she had come to where he was living with another African-looking guy in very indigenous clothing and asked for a few of my things. He gave them my hairbrush with my hair on it and other trinkets that I had left behind. He told me they took it and left. He doesn't know anything else. I was livid. I never spoke to him again and changed my number. I'm 30 now. I'm still scared to sleep alone. I don't feel the demon anymore, however, but I still have PTSD. I am still scared to have the door closed in my room. I still think about it every night before bed. I pray before bed. Although I never saw him again, I still feel something heavy. Not as bad as that time with my ex years ago in the bathroom, but it's more of a subtle heaviness. 3 years ago at my last apartment, which I believe was haunted, I was always so terrified. I would have scary dreams, the type that happen in your bedroom so you're not really sure if it's a dream or if it's real because everything looks the same. I remember having the urge to run out of my apartment sometimes. Just run. I would be on the couch, and I would feel that fight or flight feeling and just jet toward the door and stand in the hallway outside my apartment because I was terrified for no reason. Demons exist. I won't get into other small stories that I have now because they're really not major compared to this one. But I will also say, I think I have experienced angels as well. Small stuff like having lost things appear on my bed when I live alone, or being in a dangerous environment and having a sudden feeling of, I need to stop doing this now, after seeing 2 pillars of parallel fog. If there's anything to feel good about, it's believing, at least, in the theory of opposites. If there's evil, which we know that there is, then there has to be good as well. I used to live in an old farmhouse down in a much less populated area, which had always given me a feeling of something close to dread, whether I was alone in the house or not. More often than not, a chill would run down your spine in this house. For this story, only my little brother and my parents will be mentioned, my little brother of which had an imaginary friend. It had started on a rather cold and rainy day. I recall because my brothers and I had to play inside, so I decided to hang out with my little brother in his room, which was rather large with a built-in closet big enough for at least 2 people to sit in if they wanted to. On this day, I had asked to hang out with him. That's when he asked his friend if I could. He said yes, but his friend wanted to play a particular game. He wanted to play hide and seek. I didn't think much of it at the time, so I just agreed. My brother was first. He had to count in the kitchen, so I went around trying to find a hiding spot. That's when I went back into his room to see the closet open wide. For context, it was an old closet that had a locking mechanism on it, though we never had a key. I had jumped in and closed it behind me and was just waiting. And I waited, and then waited some more. I felt like I was in there for over an hour at the time. I was just about to give up and tried to open the closet to get out, but nothing happened. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it. Loud wheezing coming from beside me. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear and feel what was beside me as it had touched my leg with its skeleton-like fingers. I felt paralyzed as its hands, if you could even call them that, went from my legs up to my stomach and then to my throat. This thing was choking the life out of me, and all I could do was sit there with tears flowing down my face. But the worst thing I remember, something that cannot leave my mind, was its voice. The thing had begun giggling in what seemed like a child's giggle, but was distorted in some way that I could not explain. In a stroke of luck, or maybe even fate, just as I was at the point of no return, I heard my brother's voice shouting. He had given up trying to find me. I could hear him as he walked into the room. I began knocking as loudly as I could, and the voice and the grip just disappeared, which was when I began screaming and crying as I burst from the closet without any trouble. My brother took one look at me and began to cry as well for our parents to come in. Of course, as parents do, they ran to see what was wrong and found me on the ground as I was gasping for air, crying my heart out. I then blacked out for an uncertain amount of time, and when I woke up was in the hospital with my family sitting beside me. They looked at me with what I later learned was a mixture of pure joy to see me awake, and pure concern about what had happened. I told them everything. I have never seen anyone go from concern to absolute terror so quickly as they tried to press me further, but I couldn't tell them more than what I knew already. Not long after, the doctors came in to check on us, along with an officer to question my family, and then to question me, as I was almost choked to death. But the doctor had shown that the choke marks were much too thin, almost skeletal, to match anyone. I then told the officer everything. They ended up searching the house in case of a break-in or anything like that, but came up empty. Later that day, my brother came to me to apologize for what had happened. I was confused and asked what he meant. What he told me next chilled me to the bone. After I had agreed to play hide and seek, his friend said that he would help find me and would look in his room, which was why he didn't actually look there in the first place, but did come looking after he couldn't find me, which was when he found me in my condition. To this day, I'm not sure that thing wouldn't have killed me if my brother had not come into his room when he did, and to be honest, I'll be happy to never find out. This is an encounter I experienced in the summer of 2009. I was born and raised in the plains of Texas, specifically in an area where black-eyed kids sightings are prevalent. I had heard the stories, tales, legends, whatever you want to call them, since I was a young man, but never truly believed them. The black-eyed kids were mainly something I entertained as a joke, or something to get a rise out of people. This changed in the summer of 2009. It was a warm night in June. I was up late, around 2 a.m., as I typically like to stay up late, especially in the summer since it would be fairly warm even after the sun went down. I had just run up to the store to grab a big fountain drink and was returning into my house through the back door when I was approached by two kids, a boy and a girl. I was very startled once I realized that they were there, since I wasn't expecting to encounter anyone in my backyard so late at night. The little boy asked, "Could we come in? We need to use the phone, we're lost." This is when I noticed the blackness of their eyes. Both of them, so dark, they were like pits. This is also when my heart sank. I couldn't believe I was actually seeing them, that they were there, right in front of me. As I mentioned before, I had heard the legends of the black-eyed children most of my life, so there was no way I was going to let them in my house. I darted inside and locked the back door as quickly as I could. Once I was in, I ran upstairs and flipped on the lights to try and see if they were still outside. Thankfully, by then, they were gone. I had so much adrenaline pumping by that point, though, that I grabbed a weapon and began searching the house and making sure all doors and windows were locked. It took me hours to get to sleep that night, and it's an encounter that will stay with me for the rest of my life. These entities took the form of something most people view as innocent, weak, mild, and try to trick unsuspecting people and do God knows what with or to them. I'm just glad my reflexes kicked in and I was able to live to tell the tale. It's been 4 or 5 years since my last encounter. I think I'm safe, right? Wrong. I moved last year and I recently thought, hey, remember those kids a few years ago? Funny, they can't get you now. Boy, was I ever incorrect. I live on a mountain, and like an hour away from the beach in a super populated neighborhood with my roommates. 2 chill lesbians and a college dude. Super cool people. I think nothing can hurt me now, because there are people everywhere. But no, I'm stupid and jinx myself. I was home 2 days ago. Class was canceled, and the dude of the house was home too and taking a nap. I'm in the kitchen watching Netflix and doing homework when there's a knock on the window. Obviously, this is weird as hell, but I have weird as hell friends. Maybe one of them are trying to scare me. I brush it off and continue what I was doing, and then it happens again. Once again, I brush it off because maybe it was the snow if it wasn't one of my friends. Things like this happen all the time with them. Well, it goes on for about 10 minutes, and I'm kinda starting to freak out. My friends don't have this much patience. I go to Charlie's room, the guy, and wake him up. I'm not the one that's usually riled up, so he's concerned too. We both go to the window. I have my phone out with the camera and 911 within a touch, and Charlie has a bat. We look out the window, and no one is there. After a minute, we calm down and go and sit in the living room. Charlie's mom is a cop, so he says he'll tell her about it later. We think we're okay, so we chill and watch TV together. 30 minutes later, the doorbell rings. I go and open the door. At first, I don't see anything. Then, down on the bottom of the stairs of the apartment, I see 3 young boys dressed in black hoodies, jeans, with brown or black bangs. At first I didn't move, I was frozen in place. Then Charlie asked who it was, and I came to my senses and got a good look at the kids, then slammed the door shut behind me. I started bawling, and I mean sobbing. I had no clue what to do. Charlie's freaking out because I don't cry, especially in front of people like that. He ran to the door with the bat that we have on the windowsill and looked outside. He saw them too. He started freaking out because he didn't know what to do, so he started yelling at them to leave. He said they started smiling. I was crying even more now, and he was still screaming, and I think the neighbors wanted to call the cops. Now think about this. He didn't know what they were. He thought they were normal kids that had scared me. He didn't see their eyes yet. I started yelling at him to go inside when I hear a bunch of footsteps running up the stairs and Charlie screams and runs in. He's telling me he saw their eyes and that they were black, and now we're both freaking out and grabbing kitchen knives. Eventually we calm down and look outside again. No one's there, but we can see a group of kids past the complex with 3 that we think might have been the BEKs. I told him about the other thing that happened to me, and now we're scared to be in this house. We told the other roommates, and they thought we were high or something, so once again, no one believes me. This happened about 3 days ago, and I've been on edge ever since. I'm an actor at a haunted attraction in Pennsylvania. I was playing Jason on the hayride scene tonight. I hop up on the hayride and walk up and down the middle of it and scare people. This is my 2nd year doing it, and I absolutely love this gig. But tonight, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was the second to last wagon of the evening. I was in the middle of the wagon, headed toward the front, when I got a really bad gut feeling that something was off. I got chills immediately and tried to hide the feeling of terror I had at that moment from customers. I turned my head, and to my left I saw a girl staring at me. She looked completely normal at first, until she blinked. In what seemed like hours, I saw her blink in slow motion, her eyes going from the sides and meeting at the middle. After the first blink, I saw her eyes turn completely black. She cracked a small smile while staring at me straight through my mask and into my soul. I heard her laugh inside my head. I was frozen for a moment, and she blinked again and she looked normal. My body unfroze, and I tried my best to finish the wagon. This was literally the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. What did I see? My mom had always told me that I was gifted. I could always feel energies. I had dreams of things that would come to happen. I wouldn't say I'm a medium or anything like that. I've never communicated with spirits. More so, I'd say I attract them. We hopped apartments a lot when I was younger, and no matter where we went, an entity would immediately find me. I'd have recurring nightmares, see figures, be scratched, etc. You could say spirits liked to pick on me. Another random fact that will come into play later. I had bright blue eyes like my mother. We moved into this apartment, and things immediately went very, very poorly. I had a dream that only lasted seconds. I was in a bright white room, and there was this beast on the ceiling, and it looked into my eyes and roared. It was so incredibly loud. I woke up, and my mom and her boyfriend at the time had rushed to my aid because they heard me let out a scream that sounded like a deep, full-grown man's scream, not a prepubescent voice. My eyes turned hazel with brown splotches and have been that way ever since. I was terrified. We moved me into my big brother's room. That night I felt a presence, opened my eyes, and I saw a shadowy figure reach out and try to grab me. I sprinted out of the room and slept next to my mom or on the couch in the living room from then on, but I always felt watched from the hallway leading to my bedroom. Another thing that happened was when I was laying in bed with my mom and her boyfriend, she looked up and saw a little girl in a petticoat standing in the hallway. He saw it too. I was asleep and only knew this because they told me years later. Anyhow, everyone was being terrorized for months, and eventually we had enough. We hired someone to come in, and she immediately detected a demonic presence. She had informed us that the building used to be a medical waste facility. They'd dispose of and store blood in the basement. That sort of thing. My mom has told me since that she was able to confirm this detail, but to be truthful, I never asked how. Thinking about and speaking about this incident brings me terrible feelings. Anyhow, she blessed the place, and it didn't really do anything. We tried writing scripture on the walls and this sort of highlighter stuff that you could only see in UV light. We put up some crosses, that sort of thing. It only served to make whatever it was angrier. We eventually moved out, and my mom spoke clearly as we left. "We're leaving. You are not allowed to follow us." I've never had another experience with a spirit. A friend of mine who says that she is a medium, I'm not sure what I believe about this sort of thing, told me that maybe God, maybe a spirit, maybe myself, walled myself off spiritually from my gift. I think that maybe it was the same spirit tormenting me my entire life up until that point. When I think about this, tears immediately begin pouring from my eyes. I'm 20 now, and this was easily one of the most turbulent times of my life. This was probably the scariest thing to happen to me in real life. It took place a couple months ago while I was sightseeing the West Coast. I was visiting a small, quiet beach town in Oregon called Newport. It's basically situated on a cliff, and then down below is the beach. The beach itself is basically empty, and it is huge. It goes on for endless miles and seems like something out of a movie. I've never seen something so vast in my whole life. Anyway, I had spent most of the entire day on the beach, and when it got dark, I climbed back up the cliff to where my car was. I had originally planned to sleep on the beach in a tent, but it was starting to rain, so I figured I would just sleep in my car. I had been traveling all over Oregon and California for the last month, seeing national parks and stuff, and sleeping in my car most nights anyway. And this was literally the perfect, quiet little beach town, so I figured no big deal. I got to my car, which was parked in this public lot for beachgoers at the top of the cliff. But next to my car was the sign that said no overnight parking that I hadn't seen before, so I figured, dang, I guess I'll just go to another spot close by. So I looked on the maps on my phone and saw that 10 minutes away on the outside of town was a nature preserve. As I mentioned earlier, I had been staying at national parks and stuff, so I figured that it would be a nice place to sleep. The weather was beginning to get significantly worse, and I figured I should hurry. I drove there pretty fast, and by the time I did get there, it was completely dark and storming. I entered the nature preserve, which was a single road that followed the cliff line on the coast for a couple minutes with nothing but trees on one side and beach on the other. No cars, no houses, no buildings, no people for what seems like forever. As I drove down the road a little ways, I began to feel uneasy. It all seemed a little creepy, and I felt really alone, but the moon was shining bright through the clouds, and the beach was visible, so I figured I was all right. I found a great peak spot on the cliff overlooking the beach, and decided to back my car up on it and rest. I opened up the back of my Jeep and climbed in, and went to sleep. After a few hours, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had caused me to wake up, but there I was, awake. By this time, the storm had turned into a full-blown monsoon. I could barely see out my windows. The rain was so thick, but I could hear the waves of the ocean down below crashing against the beach. and the wind was blowing so loud that my car was shaking. I noticed water was pouring in through the cracks of my Jeep, and I tried to reach for my phone so I could turn the light on, but I realized I left it in the front, which was blocked by all my luggage, and the only way to get there was to open up the back and step outside. I was about to open the latch and let myself out, and that was when I heard it. Laughter. It sounded like a child at first, playing, but soon I realized it had to be someone older. They had to be close to the car, too, because it was raining so hard there's no way I could hear it if it was far away. I figured it might be a cop telling me to move, but then again, it had to be like 3 or 4 in the morning, and why would they be all the way out here in this weather anyway? I froze to listen, and then I could tell that it was getting closer. I obviously wanted to look up to see, but the way my Jeep was parked was backing up to the end of the cliff facing the beach, and my luggage was literally stuffed all the way through the rest of the vehicle, blocking all side and front windows. I was crammed in the way back, so at the time I was literally trapped and could only see out the back window. It was at that moment that I realized how helpless I was. Her voice grew louder and louder. I could tell now that it was in no way a cop. She was laughing hysterically, at the top of her lungs, screaming, "Ah ha 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 ha!" By the steady increasing of volume, I could tell she was definitely coming up to my car, and then between laughs, I heard her creepy voice say, "Oh, well, what are you doing all the way out here?" My heart dropped. Her voice sounded exactly like Bellatrix Lestrange from Harry Potter, and I immediately thought to myself, "Oh my God, I am going to die." I sat there, frozen solid. I didn't want to move. I remember thinking to myself, this is not happening, this is not happening, this is not happening. But it was. With the storm raging outside my car, my phone being nowhere in reach, me being trapped in the back of the Jeep with no easy exit, on the edge of a cliff in the middle of nowhere, with maniacal, laughing women getting closer and closer, I was literally living in a full-blown horror film. The only thing I could do was wait. I sat there for a few more moments, and then that's when I saw her. I had poked my head up just a bit to see out the tiny space of visible window that looked to the side of my vehicle. About 10 feet or so from the Jeep, I could see through the thick rain and heavy fog a woman standing there facing not me, thank God, but the edge of the cliff toward the beach. Her arms were flaying up and down rapidly like a bird, and her head was twitching increasingly fast, all over in irregular patterns. Her clothes were ripped, and her voice was broken, and she literally looked like the zombies on The Walking Dead. I couldn't move. Literally all the fears built up in my head of what the source of this hysterical laughter may be came true in that second. I tried rationalizing the situation to myself like, she's on drugs, she's lost her mind, or this is someone joking, or literally anything. But every time I tried, I would peek back up and see that this is something unexplicable. It made no sense. How the hell would someone be out here in what I'm pretty sure was a Category 5 monsoon, 5 miles away from anything, no car, freezing temperature, standing up, screaming in the dead of night? I just couldn't believe it. She kept laughing hysterically, shaking her body all over as if she were fully possessed. I couldn't understand what words she was shouting in between laughs, but it sounded demonic. I was mortified. By the grace of God, I ended up finding a significantly large hunting knife stowed away in the bag next to me in the back of the Jeep, and after taking one last good look at this bewildered, wild devil witch woman, I decided it was time to say a prayer and try my best to sleep. I honestly don't know how I managed to do that, because if I remember right, she probably stayed there for another 30 minutes, howling at the moon. But somehow I did. And the next morning when I woke up, I slowly stepped out of my Jeep, knife in hand, of course, and I looked around. And there was nobody there. It was as if it had never happened. The sun was shining now, and the beach was calm. It was just me, and me alone. I am currently sitting in my bed at 12:35 in my time zone right now and was watching a YouTube video a couple minutes ago. Without warning, I suddenly hear a scream. My first thought was that it was part of my video, but I checked and it was not. It sounded like it was from a man experiencing pure terror and agony. It was a single scream from the worst fear and pain imaginable that lasted 2 to 3 seconds, and then silence. My dog started barking once I heard it. It was hard to explain, but it didn't sound like anything a human was capable of making. More like a much more convincing sound from a horror movie. I have heard some weird sounds around the house, mainly in the kitchen and dining room, since I moved in. I'm pretty skeptical about things like this usually, but that was like nothing I have ever heard before. This is 100% real, and frankly, one of the scariest things I've ever had happen while being engaged with the paranormal. My sister and I had gotten a Ouija board about a year prior to this, which is the summer of 2019, on July 4th. We had gotten the board around October of 2018 that previous year, and we had been playing with it in our house. Inside of our house are a variety of spirits. We've managed to make close friendships with a few of them. One of my best friends, again this is weird to say considering he isn't alive, is a spirit named Sean. And while we are friends with the majority that live in our house and around different places in the neighborhood, there are a few that we have kept our distance from. When we first met the spirits, we learned through the board that we had an evil entity living in our house by the name of Victor. Apparently, Victor was criminally insane when he died, and has since turned evil. The other spirits told us he was residing in the office downstairs, and to never under any circumstances play with the board in there. Another spirit that used to live in our house was named Liam. And the spirits told us that he was basically, quote-unquote, Satan incarnate. He had since then left, so the only problem that we had per se was Victor. Victor mostly left us alone, besides a scary instance where he tried to possess me in my sleep. The next day the spirits told us that this was through the board, and I woke up with holes indented all over my wall. The holes, the spirits said, were bullet holes that Liam shot, because apparently he was back. When they told us Liam was back in the neighborhood as a ghost, I was extremely nervous. I had done research about ghosts like him, and nothing good ever came out of them being back. I tried to forget about it until learning that Victor had essentially left my house, and now he and Liam were both residing in another neighboring house a couple of streets over. Well, me being me, obsessed with horror, Halloween, gore, and everything else mysterious and or scary, I decided that I wanted to go and see that house. As mentioned, it was the 4th of July, and my sister, our neighbor, and I ditched the celebrations and rode our bikes to the address where they were supposed to be staying. The spirits had given it to us the day before, again through the board. Now yes, this wasn't a good idea. The last thing that you want to do is provoke an angry spirit, but I didn't really care. I wish I had, and recklessly rode on with my companions in tow. When we arrived at the house, I stopped in front of it, but my sister and neighbor kept riding their bikes. I called for them to stop, and instead they picked up speed. I was confused at first because I thought it was a joke and was laughing a bit as I kept calling their names. At one point, my neighbor and my sister turned around at the same time to look back at me. When they did, I saw that their eyes were widened and blank, and that they had eerie smiles stretched all across their faces. Instantly, I knew that this was bad. I picked up speed, and by this time, I was terrified. Both of their bikes were swerving into the street, barely missing oncoming cars. I was horrified that they would be hit. I remember crying and pedaling as fast as I could, and that was when I knew that they were possessed. Eventually, I ended up following them back to the street my house was on, and tears were streaming out of my eyes. I had never been so scared in my life. Their bikes rode into the yard of a random person, and they both toppled to the ground, flipping over the handlebars. I dropped my bike as well and ran over toward them. They sat up together, blinking. I was hyperventilating, hugging them both as tight as I could. I had honestly thought that they were going to die and that it would have been my fault. They were confused as to why I was crying and what had happened. I found out that neither of them remembered anything except turning into the street. They didn't remember riding the bikes, almost getting hit by multiple cars, or anything else at all. They had totally blacked out. After I had calmed down, we went back into my room and played the board, wanting to figure out what had happened. Apparently, Victor and Liam had possessed my sister and neighbor because I had come by their house and wanted to screw with me. Needless to say, I didn't go back to that street for the rest of the summer. This story takes place during the late summer in the 1960s in Iowa in a very small farming community. My friend's great-grandpa, Bob, owned a farm out there. He had acres of corn, wheat, potatoes, etc., but corn was his main crop, so he had a huge cornfield. It was around 2 a.m., and his grandfather couldn't sleep, so he went outside to get some fresh air. While outside, he noticed something that looked like a child walking around in the cornfield. So Bob ran back inside and grabbed his double-barrel shotgun and woke the farmhand for backup. They combed through the cornfield in an attempt to find whatever was running around out there. After a while, they still couldn't find anything, so Bob told the farmhand to go back inside the house while he stayed on the porch to watch his cornfield. Then, as he looks at the gravel road between his yard and the fence line that led to the cornfield, standing on the road was a little girl around 6 years old or so, and she was wearing a white dress that made her look like she had just gotten out of church. Bob thought that his mind must have been playing tricks on him, so he tried to lay down on the couch to rest, but also stay somewhat alert. However, not even a minute after he laid down, he heard a knock on the screen door. He walked up to the door and slightly cracked the main door open. He saw the little girl and asked, "May I help you?" The little girl said, "Mister, I'm lost, and I don't know where my parents are. Can I come in the house and use your telephone?" Bob felt uneasy, and told her that he could get her a glass of water and that he can call her parents for her if she gave him the number, but he didn't feel comfortable allowing her in his home. He felt something off about the little girl. However, the little girl insisted to be the one to call and talk to them. And Bob said, "Young lady, it's 2 a.m, and I don't feel right letting a stranger into the house, little girl or not." The little girl started to get agitated and said, "I'm not leaving until you let me in to use your phone." Startled, Bob told the little girl that he was going to call the police to come pick her up so that they could keep her safe and find her parents. He closed the door to go and call the police, and he heard someone punch the door like a grown man. He walked back and cracked the door open again, but when he looked, he realized that it was still the little girl, and that she was the one who had punched the door. But when he looked at her this time, she didn't have any eyes. Instead, she had pitch black orbs instead of eyes, and she said in a deep voice, "Let me in." Bob grabbed his shotgun and pointed it at the little girl and told her no and to go away. After this, the little girl looked right into the barrel and then back up at Bob, smiled smugly at him, and giggled before she ran back into the cornfield and disappeared. When I was in middle school, my mother and father did not live together. Eventually, we all moved into this apartment together in the local town. The local town is peaceful, calm, and barely any crime happens here. Obviously, when you're a kid, you can get scared of the dark and stuff like that. However, this wasn't just being afraid of what lurks in the darkness, because there was actually something watching me as I fell asleep. The first night I slept there, I just kept getting the feeling as if something was staring at me from the hallway. My bed was almost completely centered to where the door was, and my door was always open, so I would always be able to see what was outside. And I would just stare, always, down the hallway, thinking that something was looking back at me. It wasn't long after that before I started actually having paranormal encounters. The first paranormal encounter I ever had, one night I was sleeping in my bed. I remember feeling like something was watching me again, except this time I rolled over to see a large, black, shadowy man standing in my doorway. My eyes began to tear up, and I hid under my sheets, but this strange pressure came over my body. It was almost as if I couldn't breathe or talk. And then my ears would start ringing, and I would fall asleep with a snap of a finger. Then I would have this nightmare of my parents coming into my room slowly, coming over to my bedside table, and screaming at me. Their faces would just rot away into this deep, black shadow face, which I named Black Eyes. I would then wake up, usually in a completely different room, not knowing what I was doing. Sometimes I would be standing in the bathroom, or laying on the couch in the living room. A few times I would be standing over my parents' bed, just looking at them. This event reoccurred more times than I can even count. Then, finally, my family began to notice the figure as well. My mother at the time would have friends over and they would say something like, "Did you just see that man walk down your hallway?" She would see it too. The same thing that I saw that would stare at me and put me to sleep at night. There would be strange events around the apartment, such as the TV changing channels, random phone calls from unknown numbers in the middle of the night. One of the most random occurrences in the house would be the random, horrible smell of death coming from the bathroom. This happened about once a week at a random hour. Nobody could figure out why the bathroom would smell like rotting death, and no matter how hard my mother attempted to clean the bathroom, the smell would not go away until about 2 hours later. It would just randomly disappear, with no explanation as to what it could have been. Many people who came over would see this shadow figure. My father didn't want to believe it, as he didn't believe in ghosts, but my mother was fully prepared. She had lived in a haunted house before and wasn't surprised by what was happening. Nobody would act like they believed me when I tried to tell them what I was seeing and why I was sleepwalking at night, but in reality, I think my mother was scared. She didn't want to tell me, with me being a kid and all, that I was possibly being possessed by this shadow man and being forced to walk around the house at night. Then came one night when we had to call the police. There was music coming from downstairs around 1 to 2 a.m. We knew that the downstairs neighbors had just moved out of the apartment, but we were awoken by this church-type music. We informed the police, and they came down to the apartment only to find a locked door. They busted it down to find absolutely nothing but music on a track playing by itself in the middle of the room. We were informed of this, and that only created more of a mystery. It was evident by that point that there was something in that apartment. Something dark. Something that didn't have good intentions. Eventually, after a few years, we decided it was time to move out. We had gotten a puppy, and she was barking down the hallway at nothing, and one night a plate fell onto the ground from the cabinet. It was time to go. The final night in the apartment, my mother and I both awakened to a horrible noise of what sounded like a chainsaw destroying the kitchen cabinets. We both ran out to turn on the lights and find absolutely nothing. We both looked at each other like, "Did you hear that?" But couldn't say anything, and went back to bed. It was completely terrifying. I'm not sure what we were dealing with at this apartment. I'd like to say that it was just a ghost, but it seemed powerful. I would like to preface by saying that I am a Roman Catholic who has experienced paranormal phenomena since I was 5. My late grandmother had experienced similar phenomena, and my mother and sisters also, but to a much lesser degree. As I get older, I notice the experiences are slightly more darker in nature. I know very little of demonology, other than what has been referenced in the Bible. I try to stay away from anything referencing demons, the devil, etc., which is why this experience was so difficult, and I was not prepared. In October of 2018, I was admitted to the hospital due to an electrolyte imbalance. I was in a room with 3 other female patients. On my second night, my arms were finally free of the IV, so I was able to move around and assist the other women, who weren't as mobile, in getting ready for bed. One of the women was much older and cranky. She seemed to take an instant dislike to me when I first moved into the room, but warmed up to me after I helped her. When the lights went out, I decided to lay on my stomach and say my silent prayers. To the casual observer, it would have looked as if I was asleep. During this time, I could hear the woman that I helped argue with herself about me. She stated that I was nice, and then she replied to herself stating that I am not what I seem or something to that effect, and it went back and forth like that during my prayers. Shortly after, the room started getting really cold, really fast. I silently prayed to God to watch over her and free her from any negative influences. It was then that I heard her say these words very loudly. "I don't know the Lord's Prayer, and my name." I freaked out, quickly processing what had just happened. The woman knew that I was praying over her, and there was no way that she could have known that. In my mind, I instinctively knew that I was not up for the confrontation. I was weak and still recovering. I got up from my bed, and with my back to her, I said something like, "There is no way I can stay here now." To which she answered, "Yes, go." I won, and laughed really hard. I was amazed that the other 2 women had slept through it. It was around 10 p.m. when this occurred. The room was stiflingly cold at this point, and I ran to reception and asked to be discharged, but the charge nurse said that I couldn't leave without my doctor discharging me. I begged again to be discharged, but was denied, and the nurses tried to calm me as they got a hold of my doctor, who said that he would be in at 7 a.m. and that I needed to stay put. I asked to be relocated to another room in the interim, but the only available room was directly next door, and that was way too close for my liking, so they put me in the day room with a blanket and pillow. I used my phone to call my sister to get me out of the hospital. She works at another hospital, and told me the car wasn't home and to catch an Uber to her place. The ward was locked down for the evening though, so I couldn't leave anyway, and chose to just stay in the day room. The TV was on standby, but I could hear voices coming from it, even though the screen was blank. The voices talked about a shooting at the hospital I was in, with thousands of fatalities. It then talked about my baby nephew being in a plane that was shot down. By then, I was truly hysterical, as fear for my family took root and everything I learned went out the window. Throughout this time, the voices from the TV continued calling me names, etc. I couldn't stay any longer in the day room, and the nurses had me on a stretcher right in front of the main desk, where the charge nurse could see me. It felt like a really bad dream, and I was hysterical and paranoid. I laid down on the stretcher, and that's when I noticed hanging overhead the ward number 66. I was also on the 6th floor of the hospital. I wondered if that was why there was so much activity there. Not long after, I started hearing other voices coming from different rooms of the ward asking about me. They seemed to be communicating to each other and laughing. I started silently praying again with more conviction. A male patient in the ward nearest my stretcher started crying out for help, claiming that I was hurting him. I prayed even harder, citing the Lord's Prayer. He asked the nurse for the name of the lady outside hurting him, and she gave him my first name. He started crying again, joined by another voice 2 doors down. I prayed to know who they were in Jesus' name, and all these voices talked at once, but the one name that I could clearly make out was Beelzebub. I continued to pray throughout the first night as they taunted, laughed, cackled, and cried. At this point, the light in the man's hospital room was turned on as a nurse was with him trying to calm him down. I had been sitting up on my stretcher bed whilst praying, and watched his silhouette as he tried to inch his way to the open doorway. It was then that I noticed the odd shadow that he cast. It was so strange. It looked like a spiky-headed being with a dog. Spiky-headed in an almost cartoonish way like Bart Simpson. It continued until morning, and I was moved to a small private room awaiting the doctor. The voices were still verbally attacking and threatening me, but my hysteria was long gone by that point, and I was just determined to leave. I ended up discharging myself before the doctor arrived, but had to return as I still had the IV catheter in my arm. On my return, they placed me in another ward. I refused to go back to Ward 66, and I was allowed to recover in peace. And eventually, the mnemonic taunting stopped. I had a course of bad luck following that event. Basically, all of 2019 was a series of misfortunes and bad luck that still hasn't come right. I don't know what to do other than just keep moving on. I went to a psychiatrist last December who said that other than the trauma I would need their help with, I was in good mental health. A few years ago, my mom was sleeping downstairs, and she had an encounter with something inhuman. Anyways, I used to always get scared at night, and I would knock on their door to sleep with them. And one night, my mom heard a knock on her door, and she assumed it was me, so she said, "Come in," while still half asleep. She heard the door open, and heard something quickly patter across the ground and jump on the bed, and it began whispering in her ear and mimicking her voice. She freaked out, and opened her eyes, only to see a very skinny, small, webbed-looking creature running out of the room. Me and my dad awoke to her screaming. We believe the house was haunted because we all had paranormal experiences there. We believe it came to be haunted because the previous owners performed satanic rituals, etc. When I showed her that skinwalker picture that kind of went viral, she said they looked really similar. But we don't know if this was a skinwalker or a malvoyant spirit. In 1996-97, I lived in a fairly old terraced house with a cemetery at the end of a road. Cliché, I know, but it's an important detail. Nothing remarkable about the house or the area, it was just convenient for college. Anyway, I was up late one night on the PC in my bedroom, which looked out onto the street. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. For whatever reason, probably to give my eyes a rest, I wandered over to the window and looked down at the road in the direction of the cemetery, although it was too far down the street for me to actually see. And I saw 3 people walking slowly down the road. I could see that they were quite old and appeared to be dressed in funeral clothes, which, given the hour, was weird. There were 2 women and a man. I'd put their ages at about 80, and the woman in the middle was being steadied or guided by the other woman and the man as they came closer. I got the impression that she was upset. My first thought was that given their age, she had recently buried her husband and grief had caused her to behave slightly irrationally. It was all interesting enough for me to carry on watching as they got closer to the house. Just outside the front door of the house was a street lamp. I continued to watch them as they made their way past, but when they got to the lamppost, they all stopped, and the upset woman in the middle looked up at me and grinned. This is where it got even weirder. The grin became a sort of grimace, and if there was any color in her face to start with, it was now dead white. At that point, I realized that I was staring right into her eyes, but her eyes were pitch black. If you've ever crashed a car, the final split second before you make impact seems to drag out as you process more information than normal in the time frame. It was that sort of scenario. I'm sure that we only made eye contact for a second, but it felt like several minutes as my peripheral vision faded and I felt like all I could see were those 2 black holes in her face drawing me in. The distance between us didn't change, but somehow it felt like she was coming closer. At that point, the 2 people with her were just continuing to look down the road as if they were frozen, but waiting for this woman to finish with whatever she was doing. I was suddenly hit with this intense feeling of dread and panic, so I threw myself to the floor. As soon as I had broken away from her gaze, I felt pretty stupid that this upset old woman, who clearly needed help, had spooked me so badly. I looked out the window again, and there was no sign of them. Everyone seems to start these stories with, "I'm skeptical, but..." And this time won't be an exception. I'm not an atheist, though. So, my friends and I had a bottle of gasoline. Trust me, this isn't supposed to be a funny story. We're all car guys, so we sometimes have some contaminated gas left over. Anyways, we wanted to get rid of it the only way possible for teenagers to think of. Burn it in a field to see fire go woof, and the empty bottle go boom or whatever. The 3 of us, giggling, made our way to the nearest cornfield that had an opening, apparently from a truck making a U-turn or something, as the farmers had been planting the corn. We decided to get as much stuff to burn as we could. Dry leaves, bunches, etc., to make a huge campfire and help warm it up with half a gallon of 92-octane gasoline. It burns really well. Both of my friends were filming the whole process as I poured gasoline all over the place and made a line of gas going from the pile of the dry stuff. One of them said, "We're summoning Satan," and all of us kinda laughed it off and didn't pay much attention to it. The whole thing went pretty well. No one got hurt, we didn't set the jungle on fire or anything, just fooled around quite a bit. My buddy's phone started breaking down while filming though, and in a weird manner. The recording continued, but the picture turned black and white, and what seemed like it copied itself and pasted 8 red-tinted, semi-transparent, smaller versions of itself on the screen in a grid-like pattern, and then it stayed like that for a few seconds before the phone turned off. We just laughed at our friend's now broken Galaxy S3, yeah, it happened a while ago, and went home as it was really dark by that time. The next morning, my other friend, who had filmed it all with my Galaxy Note 2, and I waited to meet the S3 guy to complete the trio and discuss the way that we gained world dominance by the evening and such. When we saw him come up to us, he was pale as hell and his eyes were screaming terrified. Turned out his phone was all right. and even saved the video with the glitch as it was. And he watched the video right before coming to us. You guessed it. He saw what he thinks was either a demon or a ghost. As the image on his screen collapsed into the same red-tinted shatter, he turned away from the fire to see better and get a grasp of what had happened to his phone. The camera pointed away from the fire into the corn, where there was quite a distinct black and white silhouette of a ghost-like creature looking at the flames. Well, yeah, you could take it for a glitch or a glare in the camera lens, so we didn't think too much about it. The creature, if it existed, which we doubted or sure as hell wanted to doubt, was standing right next to us as if it were a fourth friend just looking calmly at the fire with us. Then we decided to watch the video from my phone to make sure that it was just a glare. We wanted to be able to sleep tight with no worries, but we wished that we hadn't by the end, as there was yet another, this time a more distinct figure to be found. Just as this other friend pointed the camera the same way that the first guy did. A face was staring at us, with an evil smile. Just a face peeking out of the corn. No body, no nothing. With no glares that looked like that, or were the same color, or any other glare at all. Days and years passed. We're still kinda skeptical about it, or at least try to be. But with all the facts combined, we, to this day, still can't find a reasonable explanation for it. We even tried to repeat the thing with the fire and took a bunch of cameras with us, but we chickened out to do it at night, as we had done the first time, so no luck. So, years from now, being an adult car guy, I have about 20 gallons of bad gasoline I would never use for any car out there. If I make it out alive, get ready for Chapter 2. I believe in the paranormal, but am skeptical about most of the stories that people tell. It's extremely hard to distinguish between a fabricated story and a true story when you can't see facial expressions or hear changes in a person's voice. About a week ago, I was sitting in my kitchen browsing the web, probably Reddit, on my phone. My kids had been asleep for about an hour, and my wife was in our room finishing up a paper for work. There wasn't a radio or television on. While browsing in complete silence, I heard my wife cough several times. The cough sounded as if she had breathed in some water and was trying to get it out of her lungs. Jokingly, I jumped out of my chair and ran over to the room where she was sitting. I started patting her back and pulling her earlobes down, again in a joking manner. She looked at me like, "What the hell?" So I told her I was trying to help since she had coughed so hard. She, still with the what the hell face, looked at me and said that she hadn't coughed. I stood there and evaluated what I may have heard. I thought it might have been one of my kids, but the cough was from a woman. It wasn't a 4-year-old or 1-year-old girl's cough. Other things about this cough is that it came from inside the house. It was the type of hack like after water goes down the wrong pipe. It was one succession of coughs, about 4 of them together. How did the coughing not continue if the coughs were heard that hard at the beginning? It didn't and still does not make sense. But that's not the only thing that happened. Fast forward to the next morning. My kids are awake and eating in the kitchen. I'm in the living room watching TV, still waking and drinking coffee, and my wife is in our room getting ready for the day. All electronics are off except the TV and our phones. My wife's phone rings from what sounds like the kitchen area. She runs to the kitchen to answer it because she was expecting an important phone call from work. She searches for her phone in the kitchen, but does not find it. She asks if it was my phone that rang, but I told her no. My phone was in my pocket. Turns out, both my wife's work phone and personal phone are in our room on the other side of the house. We checked the kitchen and surrounding rooms for anything that could have made the ring, but we found nothing. I don't know the name of the ringtone, but it's a very common ringtone for iPhones. My wife and I searched for the reasoning of why we clearly heard a phone ring in the kitchen, but no matter how hard we tried, we were unable to find a logical explanation. I was going to write it off as just another weird coincidence, but I kept thinking of how clear the phone ringing was, and how my wife had heard it too. Add this one to the cough that I heard the night before, and I start to worry that there may be an intruder in my attic. I think, nah, not possible. But I have 2 little girls and a little boy too. It's a slim chance, but I'd feel better if I just went up there and checked. I texted my wife to watch the kids because I was worried that there might be an intruder. I didn't want to verbalize it because if they were up there, then they would hear me. I check outside and around the house first for any signs of a person being on the roof or anything like that. I look for cuts in the wall and see no signs of intrusion whatsoever. I then grab the ladder to get inside the attic. The only way into this attic is through a small 2x4 foot opening at the top of the interior of a closet in one of the rooms. I grab my flashlight and my gun, set the ladder up, and plan on entering the attic as quickly and tactfully as possible. I don't want the intruder to be lying in wait. I push the drywall that blocks the opening and can hear a door swing and shut. I say swing because it sounded like a door that was on a hinge or hinges. I can't get the drywall off, and the element of surprise is now gone. I push through anyway and inspect the attic. The attic has no floorboards. You have to navigate through it by standing on the supporting beams. It's extremely annoying to have to go up there to do housework. I find no signs of anyone being up there, no entry points, and again, no cuts in any of the walls. I come down and double check that my wife and kids had stayed in the living room like I had asked in case there was an intruder. She confirms that they were, and that no door had been shut. I pretty much already knew that the door shutting wasn't them because the sound came from the attic, but there's no door in the attic. I went through a checklist of explanations to the cough, the phone ring, and the door shutting, and again, have yet to encounter a single one that makes sense. I know it sounds weird, but a freaking portal is what I'm coming up with. I lived in this house for years, and have always heard weird noises, but never something like this. Most portal stories I've heard sound totally far-fetched. Usually a portal story includes a demon, or something spiritual, but this was just totally random. People crossing dimensions to hang out in my attic? There's no malice, no sightings, no physical evidence, but the sounds were definitely heard and are inexplicable. Something else happened a few nights ago. It was around 11 p.m. I'm asleep in bed and am woken up to my wife shaking me. She tells me that she heard a door close. I say to her that it may be our 4-year-old, but she says she was watching the monitor and the cameras were on the kids. She said that she had been watching the monitor because she had been hearing weird noises. I say maybe it's just the house creaking. She claims that she heard the windows shake. Now this is significant to me because we do have some old windows. The difference between the old and new windows is that the old windows will rattle when a door is shut due to air pressure or when the house is shaking, earthquakes, and the new windows won't. So she heard a door close and the windows shake. That's enough for me to grab my gun and check for an intruder yet again. I do an interior and exterior check and of course find nothing. I go back to bed and once again conclude that there is a portal in my house. In October of 2018, I was hospitalized for 4 nights. I was put in the surgical wing due to lack of beds, and was in a 4-person room with all rooms near me having 4 people as well. The last night of my stay was on the 31st, which of course was Halloween. Other than it being noisy from the firecrackers outside, followed by the heavy rain, it was uneventful. I was particularly restless that night and not having an easy time falling asleep. Just before midnight, and I remember looking at the clock seeing 11:47 because I couldn't fall asleep. I saw a figure in the window next to my bed. It was a massive black dog, like a long-haired husky with the reddest eyes that I have ever seen. It was such a deep, but at the same time bright, crimson. It was just staring at me, and I felt completely frozen. I turned over and covered my face, and when I looked over some time later, it was gone. I should note that I was on an upper floor with a roof landing outside my window, so no way could an animal have gotten up there. I ignored it, called the nurse, and asked for something to help me sleep. They told me I didn't need anything and would eventually sleep on my own. About half an hour later, I saw the same creature staring at me from inside a window within the hospital across from mine. I immediately felt sick and panicked, and as quick as I saw it, it was gone. Several minutes later, my wing went on lockdown. The doors all closed, and all I could hear were screams and nurses running. The screams and panic went on for 4 hours. I found out the next morning that a pregnant woman in the room next to mine had died from an adverse reaction to the medication that she had been given. She went into complete psychosis, and at one point was running through the halls, banging on everyone's doors, begging for help, and telling us that the nurses were trying to kill her. I will never get those sounds out of my head. I had no idea what hellhounds were until I got home and searched. For what I had seen. I've let it lay dormant in my brain since then, but recently I've been having dreams where they show up, and it's terrifying. I'm so lost as to what to make of it, and terrified to make any assumptions. I totally forgot about this happening until my mom brought it up at dinner tonight, and now it's 9:30 at night and I'm scared all over again. This was back in high school, either my freshman or sophomore year. I missed the bus, and I didn't have a car at the time, so my mom had to drive me to school. The road my tiny neighborhood, more like a glorified cul-de-sac, was off of was a long stretch that had only one equally tiny other neighborhood and a few houses here and there. It was 6 a.m. or something and still dark outside, and it was colder than a witch's tit. As we were pulling out of the neighborhood, my mom and I both saw these 3 children in blue and white private school uniforms standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder at the entrance of the neighborhood on the sidewalk. It was either 2 girls and 1 boy or 2 boys and 1 girl. I didn't remember the ratio, but the girls wore a blue and white skirt/dress outfit and the boy wore a blue short-sleeved shirt with khaki shorts. This was weird for a few reasons. 1, it was 40 degrees outside. They looked like they were dressed for the summer, and they didn't even wear coats or anything. Secondly, there were 2 schools in the area, but not a private school till the next town over, and the blue and white weren't the school's uniform colors. Third, what young kids just stand there in a single file line not doing anything but staring? No joshing around, no nothing? Yeah, right. Lastly, this wasn't where the bus stop was. It was a few blocks down. Just a sprinkle of extra creepy on top. There weren't any streetlights. They were just standing there in the dark, not doing jack except for being creepy as hell. They were on the corner on the right, closest to the passenger side where I was obviously sitting. And of course, we were turning right. As we got closer, I thought that at first they didn't have faces, but it was just too shadowy and dark out, and the headlights only shone under their shoulders, which is how I can remember the outfits so vividly. Then we got closer, and I was relieved to see that they did have faces, but then got completely freaked all over again when I saw that their eyes were all black. Like supernatural Sam and Dean fighting demons, all black. My mom saw it before I did, and she put the pedal to the metal and hightailed it out of there. I remember trying to look back and see them, but I couldn't since it was too dark. My mom didn't go back home until the sun rose, and it was bright enough to not be afraid anymore. Of course, no one believed me at school, and my siblings thought we were just full of it, but we know what we saw. We never saw them again after that, though. I thought that they were spirits, but after a few months, I heard about the black-eyed children on YouTube or something that made the connection. We moved shortly after that due to unrelated reasons. This was 3 or 4 years ago, and I had blissfully forgotten all about it until my mom said, "Hey, remember when?" And now I want to die. I hope that my irrational anxieties and fear around children that are small enough for me to punt across the soccer field is amusing at least. Last night I woke up from a vision where my boyfriend bit me right between the shoulder blades. I turned to look at him, but he was deep asleep. The next morning he told me that he saw a dream where I bit him between his shoulder blades. We were weirded out by this. There was no bite mark on his back, but it hurt like a bitch by his words. The day starts going by and I notice him acting strangely. I've been working mostly with spirits before, and we live in a very old building with an interesting history, but this was new. He said he can't control his own body, that there is someone else with him. I started to get my stuff to banish whatever there was. I kept talking to him while gathering my things. He wasn't acting like himself anymore. He was very rude, but in a charming way while eating grapes on our bed. I banished the thing, still unsure of what it was. The rest of the day has been normal, and I haven't felt any bad energies, but my boyfriend keeps telling me that the bite between his shoulder blades keeps hurting. Does anyone have any idea what I am dealing with here? When I was approximately 15 years old, circa 1988-89, myself and my family had 2 summer holidays in Portugal, one following on from the previous year. The first holiday included myself, my older sister, mom and dad, and an uncle and aunt. The second holiday the following summer was the same people except my sister who stayed at home. Both holidays were in the same location, and both times we stayed in the same villa, which was owned by a business associate of my uncle. As such, I believe the accommodation was free, and that's why it was such a great holiday option for us all. The villa was situated about a 15 minutes walk outside of a well-known town. The first holiday where my sister was also present was event-free, and nothing unexplained happened at all. The second holiday was where I alone experienced an absolutely terrifying paranormal event, which has stayed with me to this day. The villa we stayed in was on one level, as most villas are, and had a pretty standard layout. The main door at the front led straight into a kitchen, and that led into the main lounge area. Off to the left and the right of the main lounge were 2 ensuite bathrooms where my parents and uncle and aunt slept. I slept on a fold-out bed in the lounge area, and out to the back of the property was a small swimming pool. From memory, it was a very nice, spacious villa, and probably worth quite a bit of money. Nothing happened for the entire 2-week period that we were there, except for the final night of the holiday. I often say thank God that we flew home the next morning, because I don't think I could have stayed there another night. On this final evening, everyone had just gone to bed and closed their doors, and I had just finished setting up my bed and finally turned out the lights and got under the covers. No longer than 30 seconds after getting into bed, I began to hear tapping on one of the walls. I laid there trying to guess what it might be, and just figured that it was probably one of my parents or uncle or aunt doing something in their rooms, so I ignored it. I then heard the same tapping again, but louder. I sat up in bed and tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. This is how I know that it wasn't sleep paralysis, as some people have often suggested to me, because I was peering across the dimly lit lounge room. It was then that the tapping started to spin around the room, as if the knocking was circling me as I sat there. This was naturally pretty unnerving, and I struggled to rationalize what was taking place. It was at that point that the tapping stopped, and immediately a wooden chair from the lounge room dining table made a scraping sound against the wood parquet floor that it was resting on. The sort of scraping noise a chair would make if you pulled it out from under the table to sit on it. At this point, I didn't know what was going on, and being as young as I was, I think fear got the better of me, and I shot down into the bed, turned around, and pulled the sheets up under my chin and closed my eyes. But unfortunately, it didn't end there. Next, I heard more scraping as dining chairs were being moved, followed by a very quiet, but very distinct, shuffling noise, which sounded like shuffling footsteps. These footsteps got louder as whatever it was began to approach me in the room. As it approached, I then heard this mumbling in what sounded like guttural, low-key talking, but in a language that I didn't understand or recognize. It certainly wasn't Portuguese. On top of this mumbling, I suddenly began to hear this terrifying, rasping breathing in and out in a very rhythmic fashion, the sort of rasping that someone with severe breathing difficulty would make. This breathing got louder and louder until it was right behind me, right next to my head, on the pillow, rasping loudly into my right ear. Petrified doesn't even cut it. I was simply frozen with fear. I don't think I could have turned around, even if I had wanted to. This loud, heavy breathing continued for what seemed like a lifetime, but in reality was probably about 30 or 40 seconds, and then it slowly faded away, and the room was left in silence. I laid in the bed for about another hour, unable to sleep, and listening intently for anything else, but there was nothing. Eventually I fell asleep, probably through nervous exhaustion, and when I next woke up it was 6 a.m., and daylight filled the room, and I recall the sheer feeling of relief. The first thing I did was get up and looked at the dining table area, and sure enough, 2 chairs had been moved away from their normal resting positions. And not just by a small amount, but significantly so. I also checked the rest of the communal areas in the villa to see if any doors or windows had been left open, but there was nothing. When my family got up, I told them all about what had happened, and unfortunately I was met with mainly skepticism, which I found a little upsetting at the time. To be honest, I think the experience affected me to the degree where I probably needed to go get counseling to really process it and to help get over it. But of course nothing like that was available at the time. I'm a die-hard agnostic skeptic with an open mind. I believe that anything is possible, but I want a logical and, preferably, scientific reason behind that anything. The last 10 days, however, have been absolutely insane. It started when I was a little kid. In my memories, I see kids between the ages of 5 and 11 with solid black eyes and smiles too big for their faces. I had a bad childhood, so I just figured they were added memories by an imaginative mind, because that's the answer that solidly fits my skeptical scientific worldview. Last month, I started seeing a girl. She told me about her experiences with sleep paralysis and shadow people. I explained to her that it was a rational experience caused by being in a hypnagogic state. Then she brought up the Cheshire Cat kids. Her recollections matched mine as a child. It was unnerving to say the least, and she and I spent almost an hour discussing the most minute details about them. Our stories matched. So, she does acid with her friends about 10 days ago, and told me that she stepped outside. A group of 6 of them were waiting for her. They showed her scenes from my life that were my darkest. She described them to me too accurately for her to have heard them from a second-hand source, which would be hard to do anyway, considering that I don't like sharing such detailed information. They then told her that I was going to die soon, and that she should stay away from me. This has put a monkey wrench into one of the most promising relationships of my 25 years. Since that night, I have nightmares of them coming into my room, licking my forehead, and showing me the memories of my past as if they were happening in that moment, complete with smells, sounds, sights, etc. I have written this part off as my subconscious mind reacting with my long-dormant PTSD, but they got more and more vivid. While this is happening, she has been distancing herself more and more. Last night was the weirdest part of the tale, however. I was driving down a windy country road to calm myself, and a pair of headlights flies from around a bend and runs me off the road, almost into a tree. When I looked, however, there was no car, and the headlights extinguished after passing me. I'm chalking all of this up to anxiety-started delusions and possible schizophrenia, but I cannot explain how she knew what she did, and why all of this is suddenly happening. My boyfriend at the time and I went to Key West in 2014 for vacation back in my junior year of college. Doing some bar hopping, we went into the main strip's Coyote Ugly bar. I ended up sitting next to this very thin, dark-haired woman. When I asked her if it was all right if I sat there, she turned her head toward me in an incredibly slow manner. She nodded her head up and down, equally slow. I don't think anything of it. My boyfriend and I order a drink, and we're talking amongst ourselves for a minute. I'm facing away from the woman, and I feel her tap on my shoulder. So I turn around, and she's raising her glass to me in cheers. I should explain what she looks like, because it's a lot like what I imagine a demon wearing human skin would look like. Bone thin, sallow, with stringy black hair, sharp cheekbones, and nose. Her eyes were black. I mean huge black pupils that didn't blink. They looked static. She does her cheers and opens her mouth to smile, and her gums are gray. Her teeth are gray and small, and I remember having this overwhelming feeling that she wanted to eat my flesh. I'm in pretty much panic mode at this point and whip my head back toward my boyfriend. He saw this woman too by now, and he grabs me by the arm to get us to move to the back of the room as quickly as possible. I'm basically cowering. I know, super brave. I always loved reading about demons, and possibly faced with one, I'm jello. I turn to start making our way out to the street, and the woman has got her head completely cranked around to stare at me from the bar. I feel her gazing at me as we leave, and I haul ass back to the hotel. She didn't say a single word throughout the entire encounter. I always regretted not asking her to speak. I will say, my boyfriend and I talked about it after and considered the gray teeth and mouth and general craziness possibly due to drugs. But I've seen my fair share of drug addicts. Even had one try to kidnap me. And this was not the same. I think about this episode pretty often, even years later. That feeling of encountering something soulless that wanted to harm me has never diminished. I'm a sheriff's deputy in a fairly busy county. Along with this job comes the unfortunate familiarity with what a decomposing human body smells like. To me, it's very similar to an animal carcass, but with a much sweeter odor. Not sweet in the sense that I enjoy it. Hell no. That smell normally means a bad night for me and another gruesome memory to add to my catalog of things that I would rather forget. With that out of the way, I'll get to what happened. Last night I was patrolling a geographically isolated area of the county, which is very large and sparsely populated. Having completed the hour-long trek to the northwestern county line, I began driving through the mountains back toward civilization. About 25 miles from town, or the closest semblance thereof, I hit a straight stretch of highway through a wide valley. Since the weather was nice, I had my windows rolled down. As I passed the entrance of an old logging road, that familiar smell of sweet rot suddenly filled my car. Not just a whiff, a cloud of it filled the cab as if there was a week-old human corpse sitting in the front seat next to me. It was all too familiar, but this time there was something else that I couldn't quite place. It lingered for a few moments, then went out just as quickly as it had entered. Realizing what I had just smelled, my heart sank and I pulled to the side of the road. I told myself that it was just a dead animal in the ditch, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned my car around and drove slowly back toward the logging road. The closer I got to it, the smell became stronger, and I grew more certain that I was indeed about to find a body. Holding on to a shred of hope that I was wrong, I parked my unit on the side of the highway just before the dirt road. I radioed to dispatch, told them my location, and that I would be out of my unit for a moment. I didn't say why, to avoid an awkward disregard on a possible body on the side of the road. I shined my flashlight into the ditch and into the encroaching briars and weeds as I walked closer to where I believed the source of the smell was. Once I was a few yards away from the dirt road, I saw the opening of a concrete culvert going under the highway. At this point, the smell was nearly as strong as it was when I had first passed. The opening of the culvert was about 3 feet in diameter, just large enough to hide a body inside. I cursed and held my breath as I leaned over and shined my light in there. It was just an empty tunnel stretching the width of the highway. Somewhat relieved, I stood and looked around. It smelled as if I was standing on top of whatever was emitting the odor. I searched around the brush for a moment, but found nothing. Thinking the origin might be on the opposite side of the highway, I crossed to the other ditch to continue searching. As I walked away from the other side of the road, the smell grew faint. I stopped at the opposite end of the culvert and peeked inside just to double-check. The odor was nearly gone at this point. I stood up and checked my surroundings when I heard a crack in the bush behind me, and the smell engulfed me and was even stronger than before. Thinking for a moment that the wind must have shifted, I froze when I realized that the air was dead still. Whether it was fear or something else, a shiver went down my spine. In the distance, I saw headlights coming down the highway. As the car came near, the odor seemed to move away further into the bushes toward where I had heard the crack. The car stopped, and the passenger rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. I lied and told him that I was. I thanked him for checking and walked briskly back to my car as they drove away. Then I got the heck away from there. Once I was able to get cell service, I called my friend who was patrolling the opposite side of the county. I explained what had happened, trying not to let on that I was spooked. Once I was done, he paused for a moment, then asked about the unusual hint of something which accompanied the smell. He asked if it was sulfur, and I put 2 and 2 together. It was sulfur that I had smelled. I asked if he thought that I had found a demon in the middle of nowhere, to which he simply responded with a concerned yes. A little background on this guy. He is the son of a missionary and has been around the world. He has seen, rather smelled this before, and told me that it was a very concerning experience. This spooked me even more because his responses were very out of character for him. There's always the chance of a very scientific explanation, and I hope that one is out there. I have lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and other than things falling randomly that I would usually blame on my cats, I have never experienced anything paranormal. My boyfriend claims to see white lights at night in our bedroom, but I don't know. I feel there is always a logical explanation for things. Yesterday, I felt particularly spooked in my apartment, and I felt like someone was behind me, like felt a presence. But also, I am a fat baby when it comes to these things, so I never take myself seriously. Anyway, this is where it gets weird. That night, my phone rang. I was expecting a call from my best friend, so I pick up and say hello. What I heard was a doll-like voice, laughing and giggling. She has a 1-year-old daughter who does not sound like that, but I just assumed it was her, so I was like, "Aw, hi!" All the while being creeped the F out and wondering what her daughter, who goes to bed at 8, was doing up at 12 a.m. Then it quickly cut to my friend and she was like, "Was that you? What are you doing? Tell me, are you joking with me?" I felt the blood leave my face. I was like, "No, what did you hear?" Thinking she heard the same thing, or maybe some static. She was in shock. She told me she heard a demonic man voice say, "Hello," clearly, and then cut to me saying hello. We spent the next few minutes arguing, as she thought I was joking with her, and I thought she was joking with me, even though she was not the type of person to do something like that. We established that it could have just been a weird glitch or something, and left it at that. I am so spooked from this, though. Has anyone experienced something like it? I never heard a sound like that in my life, other than maybe in movies. I'm glad she heard something too, because I feel like no one would have believed me. I don't usually get static or anything on my cell phone. Neither of us were watching something on it beforehand, and the sounds we heard were clear as day. Help me find a logical explanation. I believe in the paranormal, but I will go out of my way to weigh out every logical explanation that I can possibly think of before assuming that something is paranormal. I've told myself that this is sleep paralysis to make myself feel better, but it was such an odd encounter. I was 14 at the time that this occurred. I'm now in my late 20s. And I was really into gothic stuff, witchcraft, spooky shit, etc. I had a friend who had a Ouija board and wanted to come spend the night and play with it. Of course, I jumped on the idea, so she came right over. As I predicted, absolutely nothing happened. Though at one point the piece did slide off of the board, but we ended up blaming each other. I'm still pretty sure it was her. After a while, as I said, we got bored, and we gave up and went to sleep. About a week later, I came home from school and felt tired, which was abnormal for me because I'd normally throw my backpack down and immediately go outside. But I decided that I would take a nap. No one was home except me. I went to bed and passed out immediately. I woke up and couldn't move, and panicked. I've never had sleep paralysis before, nor had I even heard of it. So needless to say, this was horrifying. I then levitated off of my bed and toward the middle of my room, where I began to rotate in a slow circle. I felt like I was screaming internally, yet no sound was coming out of me, and then I finally woke up. I bolted out of my room and stayed up for the rest of that day. My mom insisted that it was sleep paralysis, and reassured me that it happens to people sometimes, so I thought nothing of it, and moved on. About a month later, it happens again. At night this time. I floated toward the center of the room like before, and promptly from there was slammed against my upper walls and ceiling by some sort of force that I couldn't see. I could feel its hands on me though, and I could physically feel myself hitting the wall. I felt tingly as well, as if my soul might fly out of me. I don't know exactly how to describe this feeling. It was almost like I was vibrating. Like when your foot falls asleep, but the needle jab numbness feeling doesn't feel quite painful. It was strange. I thought it was just sleep paralysis and reminded myself that I was dreaming to try and calm down, and started sort of willing myself to wake up, if that makes sense. I woke up, put on some music, and went back to sleep and slept fine. The next morning I got up for school and was absolutely covered in bruises. It literally looked as though someone had beaten me with a baseball bat. So I told my mom, who said that I had probably just thrashed around in my sleep. This wouldn't be possible though, because I slept on a very soft, queen-size mattress and I'm a small person. I even went around my bed to see if there's anything that I could have bumped into. There was nothing. She said maybe I had hit myself in my sleep. But there were bruises on my back and shoulders too, so it just didn't make sense. I tried to just brush it off, but by this point I was getting really paranoid. For the next few weeks I would have instances where I would start to fall asleep. My body would tingle like it did in the last experience, and I knew that if I let myself fall asleep that I would have the weird sleep paralysis again. So I would force myself awake and adjust my sleeping position and then try to fall asleep once more. I would do this repeatedly until I could finally drift off without this tingly sensation. This became a daily thing, but I was okay with that because I figured out how to basically avoid sleep paralysis and thought that the creepy dreams were over with. A couple of months go by with no incidents, and I had pretty much forgotten about it. By this point it never really crossed my mind anymore, but I would still have the tingly feeling from time to time. It was Saturday. My mom was out with friends, my siblings were visiting family, and I was home alone. I kept feeling very strongly like I was being watched, but I told myself that I was just being paranoid, and that it was nothing. This is where it gets weird. I'm sitting on my bed, wide awake, writing in my journal. It's about 9 p.m. or so. The radio is on full blast, and all of a sudden I'm snatched off of my bed, while wide awake, by this invisible thing. I start screaming, and it starts slamming me into walls again. Finally, after a few minutes, it stops, and I float back to the center of the room, where I slowly start spinning in circles mid-air, much like the first experience. Only this time I can see myself lying on my bed on my back, with my legs crossed as they were when I was sitting there, hyperventilating with my eyes open while some sort of figure sits next to me. It looked like it would be extremely tall if it stood up. It was skinny with a masculine-looking build. Think tall and very skinny but muscular man. It had shoulder-length wavy hair, though it was really more of just like a shadowy outline of hair. Its body was made up of swirling black smoke only, and I don't know how to explain this any better. This smoke was darker than just being black. Like, imagine if the color black could be darker than it already is. That's what that color was. I have literally never seen a color this dark anywhere else. It was like seeing a color that no one has ever seen. The thing had big yellow almond-shaped eyes and a tiny black pupil in the middle of each one, but I couldn't discern any facial features. It didn't move. It just sat there staring at me for what felt like hours. Finally, I jump awake, and I'm laying in a pool of sweat. I immediately start crying and flipping out because, like I said before, I did not fall asleep. I was wide awake and sitting up when this happened. I wasn't even thinking about sleep. I wasn't even tired. My pen was still in my hand, my radio was still up loud, and my legs were still crossed. Maybe I fainted, but that's never happened to me before. Thankfully, we moved shortly after that, and it never happened again, but to this day the hair on my arms stands up when I remember this thing. I've read a lot about sleep paralysis demons and experiences, and nothing seems to quite match what happened to me. I was sleeping the other night, and I remember waking up, or rather, so it seemed, yet it still felt like I was dreaming. I was lying in bed and remember sitting up and seeing 3 figures standing in my room with a dimly lit blue light coming from somewhere that illuminated them. I don't remember exactly what they said, or rather he said, because the one in the middle was speaking directly to me. I remember his mouth opening in a very inhuman way with the jaw extending further than it should be able to. Their mouth and eyes were black. Not like solid black, but a smoky type of black, so sort of gray, but you could still recognize teeth and such. I remember them saying something about them coming in a few days, but I don't remember what it was exactly. I then remember passing back out and waking up, actually waking up, and seeing some dark form dart across the room and hover directly over my bed. My bed is in a corner, so it was sitting or hovering between the wall and I, with about a 4-inch gap at the top at the time. I then felt a very, very intense sensation of dread and heaviness throughout my entire fiber and being, and recall feeling this for a few minutes while it was just sitting there with my back turned to it. Then, out of nowhere, a sense of euphoria and great peace came over me. No longer did I fear or dread anything, but rather I felt happy, at peace, loved. I don't really know how to describe it. I remember that thing, whatever it was no longer there. I'm not religious, but I am spiritual in the sense of believing and following my own route when it comes to what happens after human death. I believe in a very unique form of reincarnation, in which the soul, essence, energy, consciousness, whatever you want to refer to it as, travels until it finds a new place to call home, and it could span across the entire universe. That being said, I couldn't help but feel like there was actually an evil presence there with me in my room, and a guardian angel, or some other known source of good energy, cast it out. To begin with, I should explain some basic personal history. Real names will not be revealed, obviously. I have a family of 5 plus 2 spouses. My parents, my 2 brothers, my oldest brother's wife, and mine. Before getting married and moving out with my wife, I lived in the same house for 19 years. My parents bought it when I was like 6 months old, and I got married during college, so I've only ever known that house and my current apartment. I had some traumatic experiences when I was very young that are tied to one of the rooms in my parents' house, and then a few years later my parents had me move into that room. During my time in that room, I started having vicious nightmares, all involving me watching helplessly as the people that I loved were brutally murdered in graphic and creative ways, in which one constant fixture was a figure that seemed to be observing everything and watching me from a distance, never directly interacting with the chaos, but always on the edge of my vision. This figure always looked the same. A tall mass of complete opaque blackness, with the exception of an antlered animal skull where its head should be. Anyway, when I went to college, moving out of that room, the nightmares stopped completely. I didn't have a single one until I came home for winter break and stayed in that room again. During that break, my then fiancé stayed a few nights at my house with me. We slept in separate rooms, but both on the same floor. During the night, she texted me that she was having a panic attack, and that she thought she was seeing a figure. When I asked what it looked like, she described the figure from my dreams exactly, and I told her to start reading Psalms in the hopes that it might help. She immediately felt better. Not sure if it was because of the scripture itself, or if it was just a placebo, but I am a firm Christian, so I believe that it helped. We talked for a while about it before deciding to keep an eye out for more spooky shit. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. The next morning, I felt numb and out of commission, and I didn't fully recover until the next day. Every time I've gone back to that house since, I have felt an overwhelming, malicious presence there. It has the effect of weighing down on everything. It kind of feels like cotton in your ears, and making everything feel super depressing. Recently there was another development. My grandfather passed away this last semester, and my grandmother moved into the house with my parents. She's a troubled person, and she brought a lot of toxicity and conflict to the home. Last time I was there with my wife, we immediately felt something horrifyingly evil. I've always had a sensitivity to spiritual things, and it was like nothing that I have felt before. I think that it was feeding off of the conflict in the house and making things worse. My cat, who we had brought with us, immediately slipped into what looked like a super depressive state. She wouldn't play or do anything, no matter how hard we tried. The kicker was the time that I decided to try something. I walked into my old room, the one tied to my traumatic experiences, and tried to feel for any sort of extra bad energy. It was tangible. My mom and I had repainted that room the last time I was down there, and it felt very cathartic, but the power was still ever present. On an instinct, I touched a wall in the room and immediately had violent visions reliving my trauma, except the spirit was there, watching and seemingly gloating. It felt like it was trying to rub what had happened in my face like a "look what I'm capable of" sort of thing. My wife told me that I went white as a sheet and began shaking and crying, but I don't remember it. It behooves me here to add that I have seen several therapists about my traumatic experience. I don't think it was a PTSD flashback, as I've mostly worked through everything and am pretty mentally stable now. I'm relatively certain that the presence in my childhood home is evil, even demonic. I've talked to my mom, and I get the sense that she doesn't really believe me, but my wife and I are pretty certain of it. This paranormal encounter took place at the hotel I worked at last year. I was 20 years old, working at a small mom-and-pop hotel in Ontario, California. I had worked there for some time before I started to stay there for a few months. The owner taught me everything that I needed to know so that I can run his business while he went on a business trip to Africa. Mind you, I didn't have a car, so my only option was to stay there and work around the clock if need be. I didn't have to pay for the room, and I got to wash my clothes in the laundry room. There was a grocery store in walking distance, and restaurants all around me where I could get food at a discounted price since I worked at the hotel. I thought this was a sweet deal. One night, my boyfriend came down to visit, and while he was in the bathroom, I heard banging coming from the room next to ours. Then, I heard scratching on my walls. I told him to stop playing, and he didn't even know what I was talking about. The banging continued all night, so I called the front desk and told them that the people next to me were loud and that I had to be up at 6 to go down there to work. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that she hadn't rented out the room next to mine. Mind you, I had an end room. I quickly ran outside to see if the curtains were open or closed, and they were open. I could see right into that room, and no one was there. I had never been so creeped out in all my life. I decided to sage the room to get rid of any bad spirits or energy, and that worked for a while, until it didn't. The next time, something demonic happened. I was asleep and kept hearing whispers in my sleep. I hate whispers with a passion, and they creep me out to the fullest. So I sat up in bed, and I was looking around the dark room, and in the corner of the room, I saw white, glowing eyes staring at me. I felt frozen by its glare. I could see its body and saw that it was crouched down, holding its knees. Then I saw more shadows appearing closer and closer. I went to turn on the lamp next to the bed, and it didn't cut on. So my next thought was that I needed to run outside and get to safety. It took all the balls in the world for me to get up and do that. I was so scared that I couldn't even feel my legs. All I could feel was the cold wooden floor beneath me. I got to the door and flung it open, only to see that the bedroom curtains were on the outside of my room's window. The sky was black, and the clouds were a dark green with gray tint. I was mortified to realize that I was still asleep, and that I hadn't actually woken up. I looked back inside the hotel room and saw myself asleep in the bed. I screamed bloody murder, and that's when I jolted awake for real. I said a prayer and went back to sleep. The encounter that followed was even worse. Yet again I could hear things in my sleep. I was terrified and couldn't move any part of my body. I began to pray in my head as loud as I could, only to wake and feel my body slam on the bed as if I had been levitating. I called my grandma the next day, and she said that it was a demonic attack. I got my car shortly after a few days later, and never stayed in that hotel again. I was home alone on Thanksgiving. It was 2015 around evening time, and I heard some knocking. Being in a festive and playful spirit, I opened the door without looking, and automatically felt a deep sense of regret, sort of like a literal, oh shit, moment. I didn't know where it was coming from until I actively started trying to place what was wrong with the situation, and that's when I realized they didn't have any whites in their eyes. For a second I thought, isn't Halloween over? And was confused until the oldest boy made eye contact with me. And that's literally when I felt like I was staring death in the face. They wanted to come in, and the way they spoke made it seem like they knew what I was thinking and were actively mocking my helplessness. I slammed the door on them, turned all my lights on, and started watching TV while they stood outside and would occasionally knock. I felt like I lost a good 6 hours of time because I don't even remember when I fell asleep or what I was last watching. I remember when I first sat down, Gabriel Iglesias was playing, but I don't remember anything. When I woke up, it was around 2 a.m., and the lights were all off, and there was only static on the TV. I have Dish Network, and there were no power outages in my area, and I don't get static if Dish were to go out. I would get a channel listed as an HDMI and a black screen, or it would be the introduction screen where it would show two people talking about the features of Dish Network. Also, if the lights went out, they would come back on. I had to literally switch the lights on and off a few times for it to work, but no one was home. After that, I would occasionally see them outside, and every time it would be pin drop silence, and my lights would occasionally go out or something would lose power like my dish. One time my phone that was at 63% dropped to 1% in 5 minutes. After a few months of being afraid of every knock, I decided to call an imam to bless the house. I also saged the house and brought a lot of different surahs, psalms, to put in every room, including the bathrooms. Since then, the visits have stopped. However, a few months after that, I remember hearing a blood-curdling scream and a banging sound on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. A few months ago, maybe 2 or so, my mom and I heard a banging coming from the front door, and same thing. No one was there. I don't know if it was them, or something coming back, or just kids playing a prank, but I was so terrified. Roughly 12 years ago, when I was in high school, me and a group of friends, not real ones, trespassed at an abandoned building in my town. I was hesitant to even step foot on the property, but I was coerced into following them. It was horrible to say the least, but because I wanted to fit in, I kept close. I didn't know much about the place outside that it was possessed by extremely negative auras for various reasons. Come to find out, it was a sanitarium for over 30 years, then once shut down, became a very poorly practiced hospital. This led me to ask questions because I'm naturally curious. They took me to the basement, where supposedly the sanitarium would do electroshock therapy and dispose of waste. I was pushed over the edge. All of them called me names and belittled me, so I just turned and slowly went to leave, when some noise started to all of us in the far back of the basement. They all just rushed the stairs, shoving me to the side. I fell and tried to get up, but there was this heaviness around me. I looked back only to see nothing. No light, no stairs, no basement. All I heard was my name, almost as a whisper. Stupidly, I responded, then saw what I honestly believed to be 2 yellow eyes. They looked despondent and almost longing. I picked myself up and ran out, still hearing my friends rushing to escape. Once I left, though, they all came flooding towards me, asking where the hell I had been, saying that I had been gone for like 10 minutes at least. It was only a few seconds for me, though. Now that you have that part of the story, here's what's happening currently. I have been diagnosed with COVID and am not doing overly well with it. Constant cough, chest pain, pre-existing ulcer acting up causing internal bleeding, and almost always on the verge of sweating. Nothing good has been coming from this. But it gets worse, as I'm having a nightmare that I haven't had since 2011 when the manor was condemned and then demolished. I would see the eyes, in corners and side views, and they were almost always gone by the time that I would notice. Except now, in 2020, it's in my head. I'll be dreaming normally, and then I'll hear my name as a whisper and jump awake. Each night for the past week, I've been hearing my name randomly in my apartment and in my dreams, but have started seeing those eyes again. I've talked to a few people about this, and some say that my spirit had been seen by something on the other side. Basically, I'm familiar with them, and they can find me now. Others said that when I fell, that the heavy feeling was a piece of my soul being pulled away. That's why when it was demolished, I saw the eyes and heard the voice again. Either way, with COVID happening and this happening at the same time, I just don't know. When I was like 13, my mom and her boyfriend had to go to the hospital, and no one would be able to get my brother to the bus stop the next morning because they had to stay overnight. So, I got to miss school the next day to take my brother. After I made sure my brother got on the bus, I went home and cleaned and did random stuff, like a 13-year-old would do. It was around 11:45 when there was a knock on my door. Thinking it was the mailman or a neighbor or something, I opened the door and said hello. There was this kid. He couldn't have been much older than me at the time, but he had bangs that were covering his eyes, which I found weird because it was like 107 degrees out. So this kid was super still. Like, I thought that one of my friends put a mannequin there and ran away or something. But then it spoke. It sounded like a robot or something. It was like it was programmed to say this. My mother said to ask someone for a phone in fear that I get lost. Do you have a phone? At this point, I was crapping my pants because 1, I'm a 13-year-old girl, and this older boy was dressed like a burglar and at my door with half his face covered. 2, for some reason, I just couldn't look away. I felt like if I moved or said anything other than yes, that I would explode. And 3, I saw 2 other boys around the same age standing in my driveway dressed exactly the same way as the one in front of me. Baggy jeans, dark hoodie, and scruffed up Vans. I began to stutter and shake my head. It was the only thing I could do. I finally got out a no and then started to close my door, but he put his foot in the way. Then the two others started walking up, and I was going, hell no. I grabbed the bat by the door and threatened him. If you don't leave right now, I'll kick your ass and then call the cops. I shouted loud enough so that at least one of my neighbors could hear, I hoped. Now, I was this short girl with SpongeBob pajama pants on. I was in no way intimidating. Then he moved his foot and stepped back into the middle of the other two perfectly. Then the far right one said in the exact same tone of voice as the first, "I'm sorry to bother you. I'll just come again later and ask." Internally, I was planning my funeral. Just as I was about to close the door, the first one smiled and looked up. And that was when I saw that they had black eyes. Then the other two looked up, and they were the same. I was like, nope, and slammed the door shut, then called my neighbor, who was this big-ass 20-something-year-old dude. He ran over and looked for them all around my house, but he said they were gone. When I told my mom all of this, she didn't believe me and said I was lying. Said me, the girl with absolutely no social life, who was afraid of her own shadow, was lying. This happened a few years ago while I was still in college. My best friend of many years is back in town, so we decided to get together and we stayed out fairly late, but hey, we're college kids, nighttime is our thing. My friend is very, very Catholic, and she decided to drive us this night. Mind you, neither of us was doing any drinking. After many shenanigans and lots of catching up, it was time to go home. It was probably around 2, 3 a.m. Still not exhausted, but she definitely was. Well, I'm staring at her dash where one of her many Catholic baubles were in the car when we get to the last light before she drops me at my house. I look out the window, as one does, and was met with the person in the car next to us staring into the car, and I kid you not, I screamed. The guy had gray skin, black eyes with no white, and a smile that was too long with sharpened teeth. He didn't break eye contact with me, and I was freaking out. My friend was completely oblivious until I said her name. She somehow didn't hear me scream. I, as calmly as possible, told her to look at the guy in the car next to us, and then she silently screamed too, and then proceeded to freak out and gunned it out of the intersection. Once again, this was 3 a.m., the light was still red, and she was not having this. She sped to my house and had me watching behind the car to make sure that we weren't being followed, whilst praying aloud, something she never does as she knows that I'm not religious. A few very short moments later, she pulls up in front of my house. She also put her high beams on as I walked to my door because she was, again, not about this. After I was safely inside, she called my cell and had me on the phone until she made it to her house all of 3 minutes later. We were both really shaken up about it the next day, but we never talked about it again. Anytime I've tried to bring it up, she shudders and changes the topic immediately. She did tell me she went to be blessed the next day, on a random Tuesday. I can still feel the soul-shaking sensation of looking that guy in the eyes. I'm not saying it couldn't have been some dude dressed up in a costume or something, but it shook both of us to our core. It was a Monday night, at around 3 a.m, and I honestly don't feel like this was a normal human occurrence. When I was younger, my parents had gotten divorced. My dad was an abusive alcoholic who drained my mom out of a lot of money, so my mom and I left at the time. My aunt offered to let us stay at her house until we got back on our feet. Now, my aunt lives in the countryside. It's miles of farmland and a few houses every now and then. Her neighborhood is small, but everyone keeps to themselves. The area my aunt lives in is called the Base. Apparently soldiers were housed there, and eventually died and were buried on that land. Don't know the exact history, though. Driving to her place at night is super creepy and confusing. You can easily get lost, so everyone aims to reach home before the sun sets. Now back to my story. My aunt had a second house, not too far away, where her family would go to do gardening and just chill out sometimes. My cousins and my aunt thought it would be a great idea to spend a night there. The house was an old, abandoned Baptist church converted to a house that my aunt had inherited. The previous owner was a seer woman and would do readings and even give exorcisms for people. My aunt took care of her when she was ill, therefore she gave the house to my aunt. The inside was run down, one couch for about 10 of us, yeah, it was a big family, and a dirty bathroom with an annoying leaky pipe. Light barely entered the house during the day. It also gave an eerie vibe to it, because being in that house or on the land, it was always dead silent despite being surrounded by nature. That night, we all had these little rooms to sleep in, with there being so many of us that we had to share. My mom and I were in one room when I woke up to the sound of the wooden door being creaked open. I turned to see my mother upright, shaking and obviously full of fear. No one came through the door, but you could hear these loud, heavy footsteps around and inside the house. It woke everyone up, so we all huddled in the living room. All of a sudden, the lights cut off. We lit some lamps, and my uncle was getting ready to check on the noise outside when a loud banging came at the front door. It was around 1 a.m., and this place was completely deserted. We all stood still and quiet, and then the banging grew even more violent. The door began to shake, and a guttural, demonic voice was asking to be let in. Panic and terror struck all of us. My younger cousins began to scream and cry because the voice was unnatural, pure evil. The adults sent us into one room, and they formed a prayer circle in the middle of the living room. Everyone's backs were turned to the window, but I was the only one facing it, and I remember very clearly seeing a tall man with horns and a red aura looking back at me from outside. He was smiling at me, motioning me to come toward him. He had these long black fingernails that he began to scrape the window with. At this point, everyone could hear it, but by the time they turned to the window, he had vanished. However, all the doors started banging and the windows were rattling. We kids all ran out to the living room and joined the prayer circle, reciting the mantras from my religion, and then suddenly it stopped. The sun was now peeking in. It was 6 a.m. Everything felt like an hour, but we couldn't account for the rest of the time that had passed. We stayed for a few months in my aunt's original house, without ever visiting that second house. My mom eventually got remarried, so we moved. It's been about 17 years or so since that incident, and we rarely visit my aunt, like maybe once or twice a year. Since then, however, the house has been demolished. My aunt has said that strange things occurred whenever she was on that land after that incident, and she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't handle it, and they eventually sold the land, too. I live in a small town, and things like rumors tend to spread pretty quickly since folks around here are incredibly nosy beings. The most trusted source of these rumors is the local bar located in the center of the small settlement that we live in, which my father visits frequently. It is right by the school that I go to. Anyway, 2 weeks before all this bullcrap started, he came back with quite the story. It is said that something off has been going on with our town's graveyard, which is right by these creepy old woods a little bit away from the town itself. Usually takes 20 minutes to get there by car. Apparently, drunkards there claim that there's a medium disguised as a homeless man hanging around the woods surrounding the graveyard, and that sometimes he can even be found by the graves eating bread. At first, I didn't believe it, so me and my friend decided to walk to the graveyard and hang around there trying to find that guy. So we did, and the graveyard was full of people for a few hours, but the normal kind of people. A few more hours passed, and soon there was no one left except for an old, bearded man on the bench by the football field across the woods in the parking lot. He was looking at empty plastic bags with a box of cigarettes resting beside him. Nothing suspicious. My friend had the guts to walk up to him and insult him. I walked away from her, but when she crossed the line, I pulled her away, telling her that he may be a serial killer or a crazy drug addict. But he remained quiet until she yanked her hand away from mine, grabbed his box of cigarettes, and crushed it under her feet. She also threatened to hurt him if he didn't speak, and that's when he stood up and looked her dead in the eyes, and he was much taller than her too. He told her something along the lines of, "You are a disgrace in the eyes of God," and walked away onto the road until we lost track of him. I started to worry, and told her that maybe he was a priest or a monk, and now was going to tell everyone in our town how she had mocked him, and I was actually afraid. She reassured me that he was none of these things, because he had cigarettes with him, but I think those weren't even his. That night I slept over at her house because I was scared to go back to mine alone. I woke up in the middle of the night, and since I was sleeping in the same bed with her, I had a clear view of the pitch-black shadow of a man standing over her right beside her bed, his palm on her wrist. I raised my body, getting ready to stand up, but he turned his head to me and started to shake it from left to right. So I figured it was a lucid dream and rolled over to the other side, drifting back to sleep. The next morning, she looked pale and ghostly, and I asked her if she got enough rest. She informed me that she did not even sleep, and kept having problems with her breathing and her heartbeat. I was so scared that I almost pissed myself right there and then, and as of now, I am home alone and feeling like I am being watched.